everybody to tonight's still sunny lecture within the series The Great Crisis of Capitalism here at the WZB. My name is Tine Hanried. I have the pleasure of moderating tonight's event with Will Davies and our commentator Frank Fischer about the relationship of neoliberalism and populism. And as usual, I will briefly introduce our speakers, and we will have plenty of time for discussing these topics. So we are very, very glad that tonight Will Davies has joined us from the Goldsmith College at the University of London, where he is a reader in political economy and where he also received his PhD in sociology. Before joining that institution 4 years ago now, he also worked at Warwick, at the University of Oxford, at different institutes and at different think tanks as well. Now at Goldsmiths, he co-directs the Goldsmiths Political Economy Research Center, and he's also a co-investigator presently at a Center for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity, an ESRC-funded research group. Will Davies has published in many fields related to political economy and the sociology of knowledge that are relevant to tonight's topic, and has contributed to debates about the spirits of neoliberalism and economic governance, the role of indicators, metrics in political economy, the relationship between mental health and debt, behavioral sciences and economic governance, and also immigration policy. Among his already very numerous monographs, he has published two that I want to mention to you now. The one is The Happiness Industry, How the Government and Big Business Sold Us Well-Being. That was published in 2015. And just republished, or in the paperback version now, The Limits of Neoliberalism, Authority, Sovereignty, and the Logic of Competition, initially published with Sage in 2014. You will see he has plenty of ammunition to, in a minute, challenge established notions of the Homo economicus and the rise of populism. And we are also very, very lucky and fortunate that we have as a commentator tonight Frank Fischer, who agreed on a very short notice, and very short notice means today, to serve as the commentator for Will Davies' talk. Because the original commentator was Dieter Plewe, our colleague at the WZB, and he caught a bad flu last night. Frank Fischer is a researcher at Rutgers University and at Humboldt University here in Berlin, and he has taught and researched on topics that are also very related to tonight's talk, like US politics, environmental politics, foreign policy, and done so always transcontinentally between Europe, the US, and also briefly in Japan. And among his many influential books, I can also mention two. The one is The Argumentative Turn Revisited, Public Policy as Communicative Practice. That book was co-authored with Herbert Gottweis and won a Charles Taylor Book Award. And also the book Confronting Values and Policy Analysis, The Politics of Criteria, which was co-authored with John Forrester, and that book won the Aaron Wildavsky Award for enduring contributions to the field of public policy. So we are all looking forward to our two distinguished speakers on the relationship between neoliberalism and populism tonight. We follow the usual format, so a talk of about 30-40 minutes by Will, followed by a brief comment, and then you have time for Q&A and discussion, which in the end we can continue over wine and cheese. So Will, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tina, for that very generous introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to Berlin today. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you all here, and thank you to Dieter Plewe. I'm sorry that he's not able to join us this afternoon, but what I'm going to be talking about today is neoliberalism and populism, and it's going to be a fairly wide-ranging set of observations and theoretical reflections, drawing partly on a book that I've just in the final process of writing, which should be published in the autumn, which is about this particular political moment, but also thinking particularly about some of its epistemological dimensions, which in some ways gets summed up with the idea of post-truth and the crisis of expertise, but I'm trying to think more historically about some of the origins of that. If you're sick of hearing people talk about my irritating country and its irritating problems, then you have my sympathy. Sometimes I feel the same way. There is going to be a little bit of Brexit in this talk, because I think it illustrates some of the trends that I am interested in, but hopefully it doesn't just turn into a kind of purely focused on that, and it might illustrate some of the broader forces of populism and its relationship to neoliberalism around Europe and the United States and beyond today. So, on the 23rd of June 2016, the day of Britain's referendum on membership of the European Union, I was in a meeting with colleagues in the politics department, I should stress the politics department, at Goldsmiths London where I work. There was a consensus in the room that the contest would be a very close, but that the Remain campaign would win. I remember thinking at the time, if you confidently expect it to be so close, why do you seem equally confident of the outcome? If it's going to be close, that should tell us that all things are possible, and so it proved. To those of us who are members of the metropolitan elite, populist uprisings such as Brexit, Trump, and the rise of nationalist parties across Europe seems shocking and in some cases epistemologically jarring. It is becoming less shocking as time passes, but we should nevertheless remember how unprepared many of us academics were for these developments. Significantly, the only politics lecturer I know in the UK who always expressed confidence that the referendum would result in Brexit was not a polling expert, but just happened to have taught at a university well outside of metropolitan centres, as if ethnographic knowledge conveyed something that theory and quantitative knowledge could not. What was, and to some extent is, the nature of the shock exactly? Populism is disruptive of many things, but where I think right-wing populism is most epistemologically disruptive is with regards to the notion of human interests that dates back to the early modern era and became the pivotal building block of liberalism in the work of Thomas Hobbes and then of economics in the Scottish Enlightenment. As Alfred Hirschman tells us, the discovery of interest was a crucial ingredient for economic optimism in The Passions and the Interests because it cut between the traditional concepts of reason, which is true but unpersuasive, and passion, which is persuasive but dangerous. In Hirschman's words, quote, interest was seen to partake in effect of the better nature of each, as the passion of self-love upgraded and contained by reason, and as reason given direction and force by that passion, end quote. On a relatively superficial level, support for Brexit and for Trump appears to be against the interests of both national macroeconomies and, more importantly, of many of the people who voted for them. The regions most economically dependent on the EU voted most heavily for Brexit. This is a graph on the left from the Financial Times showing that how this was playing out. The vast majority of US GDP is produced by territories that voted for Clinton. This is a graph from Brookings on the right showing that. European nationalism demonstrates some similar trends, whereby, for example, Hungary receives net inflow of income from the EU worth 5% of GDP, yet Brussels is represented as a colonizing power by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. This is all what Ali Russell Hochschild refers to as the Great Paradox in her ethnography of Tea Party activists in Louisiana, namely that populations and regions that are most dependent on fiscal redistribution are most hostile to the elites that oversee it. The problem is compounded by closer inspection of the demographics behind some of these developments, which show that the left-behind narrative of right-wing populism doesn't always hold up that well. In the case of Brexit and Trump, voters were older than average, whiter, more rural and less healthy than average, partly due to age, but also included some relatively prosperous populations and were not actually getting worse off on average. Many felt that their lives were not improving, and there are obviously localized exceptions, but explanations based on material interest become hard to sustain. Ultimately, these political movements have an, I would suggest, anti-utilitarian quality, which targets concepts of progress, stable interests, and measurable welfare enhancements. That is, the very idea of liberal economics. So difficult is it for liberals to cope with this, including many academics, that they would rather believe that Vladimir Putin is rigging the game than that maybe the notion of interests is not relevant or not working. Alternatively, we revert back to a Hobbesian view of the passions as things that have reinvaded the political realm as entirely irrational psychic forces. Psychoanalysis has long recognized the logic in apparently self-destructive behaviors. Sigmund Freud's famous essay of 1920, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, explored why people repeatedly do things that cause them displeasure or harm. Freud argued that people return to events that have caused them pain so that in doing so they can achieve mastery over them. The urge to control one's pain may be a more powerful one than the simple desire for its relief, a level of psychological nuance that escaped the likes of Jeremy Bentham. Perhaps not irrelevantly here on the topic of control, this was the famous slogan of the pro-Brexit campaign. Similarly, studies of post-traumatic stress disorder have sought to understand why certain traumas result in post-traumatic stress disorder, while others, apparently similar ones, do not. One crucial issue is whether the victim felt trapped at any stage. The psychological horror of trauma is not in the injury itself necessarily, but in the sense there is no escape from it. I'm not suggesting that this in itself explains nationalist votes, but we need to enrich our psychological assumptions if we're to move beyond a liberal framework based upon the idea of interests, and to recognize that the language of economic progress has come to feel like a trap where no alternatives are provided. In the words of Hannah Arendt, quote, "To use reason when reason is used as a trap is not rational, just as to use a gun in self-defense is not irrational." Another contribution of psychology and psychoanalysis, as it was also for the first generation Frankfurt School, is to understand the role of violence and the appeal of violence in nationalist populism. Studies show that one of the best predictors of voting for Trump, Brexit, or Le Pen is support for the death penalty. This is some evidence from the UK in relation to hostility to the European Union, quite a close correlation. Then there is some astonishing evidence of how UKIP voters, this is from a polling company, but view torture, that there is actually greater support for torture than actually the belief that torture actually works. One thing that is going on here is the desire for a state that is not afraid or embarrassed to use violence to act to excess, that is, to reverse the trends towards measurement, utility, and invisibility that Foucault saw as constituting political modernity. In Foucauldian language, what is being demanded, and what I think is at the heart of Brexit, incidentally, is the replacement of governmentality by sovereignty. Less a science of population, as Foucault understood governmentality, and more a symbolic and violent defense of territory and law, as he understood sovereignty. Sociology has dealt with similar issues of gratuitous punishment and regress in the past. Sociologists have recognized that not only does capitalism rely on non-utilitarian moral resources, as demonstrated by Durkheim, for example, but that it features anti-utilitarian elements as well. I just want to identify three quick examples. Max Weber's famous theory of the Protestant Ethic was a theory not only of the normative conditions of capitalism, but the anti-utilitarian conditions. The Protestant engages in gratuitous self-denial or even gratuitous self-harm so as to seek approval from God, which the Protestant God will never actually provide. Then consider the emphasis that Thorstein Veblen placed on sabotage within industrial competition, in which corporate strategies are as much about blocking superior products and technologies so as to preserve an advantage as utilizing them, or what he termed the capitalization of inefficiency. By this account, there is nothing inherently progressive about capitalism. And finally, one might consider the recent work of Maurizio Lazzarato on debt for how we can think about the punitive qualities of financialization in which debt inculcates guilt, leading to impossible demands for greater productivity. And what I want to do in this lecture is to apply neoliberalism as a hermeneutic device, that is, to place apparently irrational and anti-utilitarian activities against a backdrop of neoliberal thought and neoliberal reason. This isn't to say that populism from both left and right isn't a threat to neoliberalism as a technocratic mode of regulation. It clearly is in lots of ways. But that in certain ways we can see nationalist populism in particular as a radicalization of neoliberal ethics. I want to do this in two ways. Firstly, how is resentment a necessary and inevitable ingredient of neoliberalism? And secondly, why, to a great extent, does that resentment bypass the very rich? In my book that Tina mentioned, The Limits of Neoliberalism, I explore the way in which competition becomes the governing principle of neoliberal society and on which all claims to political authority must consequently rest. A crucial part of my argument is that over the course of neoliberal intellectual and political history over the 20th century, there was a shift from privileging the competitive market as a type of institution to privileging competitiveness as a cultural or psychological quality of people, places, and organizations, including those that symbolize and administer the nation state itself. And this roughly characterizes two different visions of the nature of competition as a form of valuation. One which privileges a form of pluralism, and another that privileges Darwinian processes of elimination and monopoly. The former, that's on the left, views competition as a system characterized by pluralism, in which the state's role is to enforce instruments of agreement, namely contract, a functioning price system, and protection of certain economic rights. But in the latter, competition is how the strong overwhelm and eliminate the weak in a kind of Darwinian process to discover who is right and who is wrong. Crucially, this approach to competition isn't limited to markets and can be pushed into social, private, and cultural life, as summed up in Foucault's well-known phrase that Gary Becker, the Chicago economist, imagines every individual as, quote, an entrepreneur of himself. I explore this in the book, particularly in the transformation of antitrust, where the Chicago School drives an increasingly pro-monopoly agenda developed intellectually in the 1950s, pushed into the US courts in the 1970s, then into the European Commission in the 1990s and 2000s. I also look at competitiveness strategies which seek to remodel political decision-making around the logic of business strategy. The very meaning and experience of competition is transformed by this shift from one regime evaluation to the other. But this isn't only an ideology of regulation and policy, it also shapes a certain culture and spirit of capitalism that we can see around us today. The best manifestation of this is in the platform economy, which demonstrates that the end goal of this form of competition is not simply monopoly over the market, but to own and control markets as such. That, you probably can't read it, but this is Uber's losses, just to show that if Uber's growth model is to create greater and greater loss as a way of getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The way to do this is not to seek profit or growth through investment, but to systematically seek to destroy existing businesses. This is what is known as disruption in Silicon Valley, where the logic is as much about identifying stable structures to destroy as much as it is about producing superior ones. This is quite Vebelenian. Against the liberal economic principle that competitive markets are a positive-sum game, we're surrounded by indications that competition is a zero-sum game, or possibly even a negative-sum game. Culturally, we see this in things like talent shows, where there is just as much entertainment value, or possibly more, in the emotional elimination of the loser as in the joy and the success of the winner. In the case of the platform economy, this is an extreme Schumpeterian vision in which capital starts to break away from the market and seeks to govern markets. Amazon is developing what the legal scholar Frank Pasquale terms functional sovereignty, becoming something more like a regulator of retail than a supplier. In the language of venture capitalists such as Peter Thiel, Jeff Bezos and others are not entrepreneurs but founders of world-changing empires. Entrepreneurship takes on more and more attributes of the state. First, public services, in form of privatization, then forms of calculated violence, such as prisons, border enforcement, security contractors, and then quasi-sovereignty over whole territories. And it's appropriate in a way that yesterday saw Elon Musk send his car into space. The problem with this as a model of political economy is obviously what happens to those that do not triumph and cause disruption but suffer it, hence the spectre of jobless futures and surplus populations. However, there is also a problem of moral philosophy here. As the ethos of competitiveness breaks free of any normative institutions or metrics, it produces a relativist moral order in which value can only be gauged relative to the success and failure of others. Unlike liberalism, or even ordoliberalism, this is a moral philosophy in which value becomes reflected only in status, a wholly relative index, and therefore established within an intersubjective space of constant competition. Liberal notions of welfare, utility, and interests do not grasp an ethos and psychology in which value is identified only via Darwinian processes of defense against the strong and aggression towards the weak. What that liberal language assumes is the existence of a stable metric of value that is itself devoured by competitiveness. As an aside, we can witness this crisis of valuation in a couple of other areas that I think have been especially pronounced in the English-speaking world. Firstly, the rise of behavioral economics, especially since the financial crisis, has been a kind of, the expression we have is a canary in the mine shaft. That is, it provided a mild hint that capitalism had broken free of utilitarianism and interest-based liberalism. As a policy tool, behavioral economics, this is nudge and this sort of thing, seeks to deal with self-destructive activity in relation to pensions, nutrition, civic behavior, and so on, but is also a symptom of the fact that liberal competitive markets are no longer an adequate arena for, in Hirschman's terms, combating passions and elevating interests. Secondly, Tina mentioned some of my other work on the sociology of mental health. Secondly, the rise of depression and anxiety, especially among young people, can be viewed partly as a symptom of a broader Darwinian culture in which competition is viewed as the discovery of a victor and elimination of everyone else, rather than in the liberal terms of pluralism and egalitarian coexistence. If you read the work of someone like Alan Ehrenberg on the history of depression, it's very clear that the way in which performance anxiety and the changes in face of depression since the 60s go together. But how can we relate this feature of neoliberalism back to conservative populism? The first thing to say is that sabotage is entirely reasonable within this moral framework. In a game of status rather than of welfare enhancement, it is just as reasonable to attack the strong as it is to improve oneself. In that sense, the resentment that fuels populism is not inconsistent with neoliberal competitiveness. From the original Austrian neoliberal perspective of Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, there is no guarantee that competition will make us all better off. That would be something for statisticians and experts to worry about. In that sense, neoliberalism in that tradition is not, strictly speaking, an economic growth model, as regulation scholars might assume, but a political philosophy for managing conflict. Its original inspiration is not Adam Smith, but Thomas Hobbes. Evidence from the early 1980s and the 2010s demonstrates that where the neoliberal state has the option to actively pursue economic growth and prosperity, or alternatively, to reassert the sovereignty of money, it will take the latter option every time. It is all, and of course this is what's going on in the Eurozone, or has been going on in the Eurozone for the last decade. It is also worth recalling that in the work of Hayek in particular, the market makes no demand on people to act rationally. In fact, it may work better if they do not. If, as Hirschman argues, the difference between passions and interests is that the latter involve careful reflection and calculation, Hayek's argument is that spontaneous order arises more out of passions than out of interests. Hayek would rather we avoid critical and objective reflection. Who is to say that destructive or self-destructive behavior is not warranted in a neoliberal society? Not Hayek. His answer would be, who are you to say what counts as destruction? Secondly, in this relativist moral economy of competitiveness, dynamic elements are everything, not a stock or aggregation of welfare or value, but variations in welfare or value become key. If one looks across the growing body of evidence regarding populism of the past 2 years, there are some interesting findings. What appears to drive populism, and what I think is key for understanding resentment in particular, is not a loss of welfare or inequality as such, but changes in status, where status is a necessarily relative category. Hardship is felt relative to others, relative to where one would like to be, and relative to how things were in the recent past. These are just some Pettigrew. The Pettigrew paper is a study of a psychological study of the attitudes of Trump supporters, showing that relative deprivation was the key psychological trait, which didn't correlate necessarily to material deprivation. I'm referring in the second one to Mike Davis's study of the Midwest that was published in Jacobin magazine, which just pointed out that the counties that swung from Obama to Trump in 2016 had suffered a plant closure during the campaign itself. So they're very important recent experiences that played a key role here. The paper published by Brookings, by Algen and others, showing that support for populist parties correlates to increases in unemployment, not aggregate levels of unemployment. So it's the changing nature of status. This is a kind of Veblennian story, which in a way, I mentioned Piketty there at the bottom. Of course, that's also a sort of Veblennian story of conspicuous consumption, but of interpersonal comparison. Again, this was a problem that behavioral economists had been highlighting as one of heuristics. For instance, people's idea of a good price depends on what others have paid for it, but which exploded into the political domain in ways mainstream economists couldn't understand. I now want to move on to the second way in which this populism is fueled by a spirit of neoliberalism, which is not to say that it is neoliberal, but that neoliberalism has created the conditions for it, namely the apparently paradoxical role of the super-rich in driving, exploiting, and leading the populist moment. To put this in more familiar terms of everyday discussion on the left, at any rate, why is an anti-elitist politics not targeting the rich to a greater extent? Why is class not a more powerful feature of these upheavals? Of course, there is considerable left-wing populism around: Podemos, Sanders, Corbyn, Mélenchon, and if you include Syriza. I don't mean to dismiss the long-term potential of these movements and parties, but we need to also reflect on the strange status of the super-rich in right-wing populism. A few features are worth noting. Firstly, leaders such as Beppe Grillo, Donald Trump, and Marine Le Pen are extremely rich in their own right. This is significant for reasons that I will detail. Secondly, we are currently witnessing something potentially more damaging to democracy than corporate lobbying, which is the power of private equity, private firms, and private families. Hedge funds run by figures such as Robert Mercer, who funds Breitbart Media, and on the liberal side, George Soros, are becoming political agents in their own right. Private firms, such as that of the Koch brothers or Facebook, are exercising political power, but with far less of the transparency than the legal system imposes on listed companies. The steady rise of the top 0.0001%, as detailed by Piketty, is being felt in the democratic arena, though in ways that we largely can't be entirely sure of. When Colin Crouch warned against post-democracy in his book of that name in 2004, the main danger that he was describing was that of the corporation and lobbying. Already that diagnosis could be a little dated, with new dangers emerging from private firms and private equity. Conspiracy theory is the logical outcome of this. Now, it is relatively uncontroversial to point out that the neoliberal policy era that began in the late 1970s produced the concentrations of wealth that facilitate this level of financial autonomy. That is, you've probably seen these kind of Piketty graphs of the top 1%. That's actually in the Anglo-Saxon countries where it's most pronounced. However, I also want to now highlight certain consistencies in how the present epistemological crisis is shaped by neoliberal critique in ways that go back several decades. In certain ways, this populist moment can be seen as a consummation of a neoliberal epistemological program. As some of you may be aware of, Philip Mirowski has a very nice paper on post-truth called Hell is Truth Seen Too Late, which argues some of these points as well. The key to understanding this, I would suggest, can be found within the peculiar neoliberal critique of monopoly, to think about this in terms of competition. In particular, the liberal and ordo-liberal attack on monopolies of capital is reinvented in the Austrian and American traditions as an attack on monopolies of representation. So rather than monopolies of capital being a problem, monopolies of representation become what considered to be anti-competitive. Neoliberalism, in its Austrian and American traditions, is far less concerned with who has the right to control and benefit from social and natural life, that is, via property rights, than with who has the right to describe it, that is, via expert social science, but also via journalism, scholarship, and any other code of symbolic representation. In terms of the genealogy of neoliberal thought, elements of a populist attack on experts and academics can be found in Friedrich Hayek's writing about, in his terms, intellectuals in the 1940s, in which he accuses intellectuals of privileging abstract theoretical perspectives over embodied, technically equipped, and local perspectives. This is also at the heart of the road to serfdom. Intellectuals become predisposed towards socialism, Hayek argued, because they insist on studying and theorizing society as a whole, seeking general laws. That expert-led epistemological project is also what Foucault saw as the foundation of governmentality, namely the search for quasi-natural laws within aggregations of socio-economic activity. In that sense, Hayek was against governmentality, believing that markets could serve instead of disciplinary techniques such as statistics or even of economics. Universities become treated as cartels in the competition to represent society and nature. One way of understanding the epistemological advantage of the market, from Hayek's perspective, is that market activity is self-quantifying. It generates types of fact and data by default, rather than with the deliberate intervention of an expert of some kind. Viewed this way, we can see a clear continuity between the neoliberal vision of the market and the rise of big data, tracking devices, and self-tracking practices, which remove processes of aggregation from the hands of intellectuals. The affordances of platforms such as Facebook and data analytics appear to have been seized by populists, though it is by definition hard to know to what extent this is the case, but the epistemological direction is the same as the one initially pursued by Hayek back in the 1940s. Populist resentment today is aimed in various directions, depending on varieties of populism. But one crucial feature of it, that on some occasions spans both left and right, is its targeting of the traditional means of representation. It targets the means of representation, especially the media. In the UK, the BBC is attacked from both the pro-Brexit right and the pro-Corbyn left for misrepresenting them. Trump supporters referred to the Clinton media, and recent evidence shows that 61% of Clinton voters trusted the media, however understood, compared to just 27% of Trump voters. In France, Le Pen and her supporters referred to the la caste of networks of journalists and politicians. What is the essence of this attack on the media and on expertise? Firstly, it is the claim of hypocrisy that lurks also in Hayek's critique. These, by that account, are individuals who promise to put aside their own personal view in favour of a general and neutral view, but then they don't. The knowledge claims that they make are ones that tacitly benefit them. That is the charge. As Hayek argued, and subsequently the Virginia School of Public Choice push argued, experts represent the world in ways that produces more power and money for other experts. This seems to trigger far deeper political emotions than economic inequality and injustice are able to. This would have been no surprise to Hannah Arendt, who wrote in On Violence, quote, "If we inquire historically into the causes likely to transform engagé into enragé, from engagement into enragement, it is not injustice that ranks first, but hypocrisy." Secondly, there is a sense that the codes overseen by professions and experts have become tyrannical in the way that Hayek argued. This is the furious critique that becomes distilled into the idea of political correctness, which is so powerful on the populist right, the idea that you're not allowed to say certain things. It is perhaps inevitable that universities have therefore been dragged into the culture wars that have now produced the populist upheavals. In the case of Brexit and Trump, there are various ways of describing and explaining the split that runs down the middle of these two countries, but one simple geographic one is the split between centres of knowledge creation and everywhere else. The very geo-economic forces that Saskia Sassen and others spotted in the 1990s, privileging metropolitan clusters as centres of post-industrial prosperity, also gave rise to forms of abandonment elsewhere that were as much cultural as they were economic. The map of Brexit Britain shows clearly the areas of England voting to remain in the European Union are major metropolitan centres, these are the yellow ones, the triangle of knowledge-intensive industry between London, Bristol and Oxford, that's coming west out of London, and then finally there are small, you can't see it very well, but there are small towns dotted around that have no clear reason to remain supporting towns other than they happen to have universities. There's Exeter, Norwich, Leicester, Newcastle. These are towns surrounded by seas of blue but have universities at the centre of them. This is a trend that has played out already to a great extent in the United States. Since the referendum, various forces have emerged seeking to vilify universities on the basis that they are internationalist and using their symbolic monopoly to block Brexit and its success. So we are now all in the thick of it. So if I apologise for talking about too much about Brexit, but it's difficult not to now that, in a sense, we've been dragged into the fray as academics and scholars. Against this backdrop, the rich have a certain advantage, one that Hochschild picks up on in Strangers in Their Own Land, and which Trump actively seized in his election campaign. Possession of large amounts of private money releases one from the charge of hypocrisy. So if hypocrisy is the worst crime that can be made in public life, it's the rise of private wealth, private equity, and the private firm that enables a type of leadership that is free from hypocrisy. As an entrepreneur and oligarch, one's interests are entirely clear and easy to anticipate. Even more than the CEO, the chief executive, who, as in shareholder value ideology, is at least supposed to represent shareholders, the hedge fund manager, the private family empire or other billionaire makes no claim to represent anyone other than themselves. When they speak, their words are a simple reflection of their own interests. Language reflects personal interest and passion all at once. This is in contrast to the technocrat, professional politician, the expert, the journalist, or whoever else who claims to have fused interest and reason in some way, but is therefore liable to fall into hypocrisy. We therefore have to take seriously the proposition that there is, from a populist and a neoliberal perspective, a moral purity in vast concentrations of private wealth that there can never be in public life. Oddly enough, relatively deprived people may be able to sympathise with an oligarch in ways that they cannot do with a public official or representative. If they turn out to be tax evaders or polluters, the answer, this is what Hochschild's book uncovers so effectively, Strangers in Their Own Land, if they turn out to be tax evaders or polluters, the answer is, well, we've all done that and I would do the same. This is one of the main discoveries in Hochschild's analysis. I want to end with a couple of brief reflections for political economy and for politics. For political economy, it seems clear that we need to build more bridges between the study of capitalism, understood as a system for the regulation of material accumulation, with the sociology of knowledge, so as to pursue the two side by side. There is a precedent for this in the social studies of finance, which was provoked especially by the shift of Michel Calon from social studies of science into economic sociology in the 1990s. The problem now is more about how to bridge to media studies and software studies, and not necessarily in the Bourdieusian terms of treating cultural capital as a source of class stratification. For instance, Jodie Dean's notion of communicative capitalism is one example of what this might look like. Secondly, in the political arena, which is where things are much harder, progressive political forces are clearly in very deep trouble and have been ever since the global financial crisis. There was a phrase of PASOKification was a term that went around for a while, what was happening to progressive parties. In some respects, they deserve what has happened. The great cultural error of centrist parties and of the European Union is, in Hirschman's terms, to conflate interests with rationality, producing technocratic regimes where it wasn't clear what was a matter of objective truth and what was a matter of political economic interest. This provokes deep suspicion. I'm just going to leave up that Arendt quote rather than read it out, but it's against this, populism often performs the opposite mistake of collapsing interests into passions, a situation which is ripe for manipulation and propaganda. For the time being, the question of how to make the truth persuasive, which was answered in early modernity with the notion of interest, has no easy answer and therefore requires confronting all over again. So, thank you.
Thank you. That was certainly very interesting. I stepped in here at the last minute, and Dieter was kind enough to magnanimously concede that he was doing me no favor here. Not because it's not interesting, but because this paper and talk covers a range of theoretical ideas moving very fast across a wide field. I think, this is really a critical question. Why did this populist movement emerge, and what are these people thinking about? I think that's a real challenge for our time, but I'm not completely convinced that neoliberalism carries the whole story. There are other elements about country, fatherland, Heimat here, right? You get a new Bureau of Heimat Affairs that's motivating these people who I'm not sure they're thinking so much about their individual situation, and I'm not really sure, but I do think, and some of the slides here the one slide seemed to suggest, that a lot of these people in the US, I can't speak so much about Britain, but are indeed hurting. It's not, you can speak about relative this and that, but there are a lot of people in areas where the factories are closed and so forth, where there's desperate unemployment and extreme anger. And what I find a bit missing from the talk is the demagogic rabble-rousing that led these people to rise up the way they did. It doesn't mean they didn't have these concerns, but it was actually the hypocrisy of very rich people who organized them for their own self-interest. Why they haven't come to see what's going on yet is an open question that's widely debated. But it's a critical question. And I think it's really important to bring emotion back in. I don't think one can get at the root of this without that. As I read the paper, I remembered being told as a graduate student that I couldn't speak of false consciousness because it couldn't be operationalized. So bringing emotion back in definitely poses a challenge in the social sciences today in mainstream positivist rational choice circles. But there's no escape if we want to understand this. So this is, I wasn't completely happy with the idea that neoliberalism is actually not an economic idea, but rather a political idea. I'd prefer to say that it's an economic growth idea with a political philosophy embedded in it, hidden in it, actually. But we could quarrel over that. I didn't quite get the part about Hayek, and I got it, but I wasn't quite convinced without hearing more about the turn to the spontaneity of the market. That's clear enough from Hayek. but then somehow that this becomes a better alternative than governability, which is a strategy to manage conflict, because in part of that discussion, Hayek and von Mises are saying that there's no guarantee here. What happens is just that the market and its passions are better. And also, I don't see, then Will goes on to say that there's an extension of this is that is the big data and these sorts of things. But for me, the key to governmentality that's different is that it's organizing these kinds of knowledges, whereas there's nothing in Hayek that I see that organizes this knowledge in the interest of conflict. Maybe Will can better explain that. It was one of those cases where I felt we were moving very quickly. For me, one of the most interesting parts was the discussion of Hayek and knowledge. This is a part that's not well understood about Hayek, that's actually rather brilliant in my opinion. I mean, I'm a real anti-Hayek kind of person, but the guy did have an understanding of knowledge in context, and a kind of critique of what we'd generally consider the universal positivist sort of knowledge. Whether that leads to the kind of society that he would call for necessarily is another interesting question. But I think that's important. I'll just say also something about expertise. It's true that expertise is generalizable and does not represent the reality of these people. This everywhere, this sort of went unseen. But what we actually have here is a politics of expertise, because these people have gone on to develop their own expertise, to refer to Buchanan and the public choice group. This is an ideological orientation, and the idea that somehow experts are just out, or scientists are out to make money, seems not exactly enough to explain what's going on. And if it's true, then I sort of missed out something on my whole career here, because I didn't become all that well off. And then the, well, relatively I did. I'll concede that. And finally, the media. I mean, they also have developed, they complain about the media, but never Fox News. This is isn't part of the critique. What actually drives this is that they have an entire alternative parallel media world that's generating hypocritical, false, alternative facts all the time. So the people who follow this movement never listen to CNN. That's the evil enemy. They listen to the other that totally supports their assumptions. So they say this, but it's not simply the case that all media is misrepresenting them. I found this really interesting. I want to read the book. These are just some thoughts that came to mind in about an hour and a half that I had to consider the paper, and should be taken in that light. I found it really thought-provoking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. I really appreciate those comments and for those reflections. I'm not sure if there was anything in particular that I need to come back to. I mean, it's a partial account. I think partly what I'm trying to do is to say, can we see a continuity between the political regime that preceded these events and the present, rather than to see it in the way that is common from I suppose, a sort of Marxist perspective or something, which is that some kind of crisis of capitalism has come along, and that the before and after, that there is a kind of a rupture and a break, whereas, of course, there is elements of continuity. And as I said, I mean, I think what I'm trying to do is partly to use neoliberal thought as this kind of hermeneutic device to try and understand what the critique of representation and the critique of knowledge and of expert knowledge consists of. I mean, on the point about Hayek and government, I think we agree with each other, actually. I mean, to go into that a little bit more, I mean, Foucault's notion of government, which is what I'm thinking of, is that in the second half of the 17th century, there was the development of an expert culture, which included the formation of things like statistics and what became political economy. And that privileges the right of certain individuals to stand outside of society and the economy and to collect data, facts, the sort of stuff Mary Povey's History of the Modern Facts about this sort of thing, and that becomes a level of truth that informs government. So that for Foucault, governmentality is what he calls a perspective of population, that it's an attempt to try and turn, to see society in the same way you might see the natural world. And this is exactly what Hayek is dedicated to attacking. All his work on scientism, on intellectuals, on socialism, the use of knowledge in society, is against the notion that it's possible for people like many of us in this room to produce this type of objective knowledge upon situations that we're necessarily part of. So in that sense, it's a sort of it's almost like a sort of postmodern theory of performativity or something, which is the notion that experts are also actors in the world and that they also have things that they want and there are things that they are pursuing and that they have power games that they are also pursuing as well. I mean, my characterization of the Virginia School was too brief, and I probably should have just skipped right over that rather than mischaracterize it in that way. But the expert is also a political actor, and that is a type of cynicism towards the university and towards the expert and towards the statistician. And at the moment we have attacks going on against in Britain against the permanent civil service, the kind of original sort of Weberian bureaucrat, is under fire from various corners of the Conservative Party and from the right-wing media because they're not considered to be neutral at all. So the very possibility of some kind of position outside of competition, be it political or economic, is discounted by this type of perspective in a way that actually is not the case. And this is kind of what I was trying to suggest in the ordo-liberal tradition. Because in the ordo-liberal tradition, there is at least the position for the legal mentality, which frames the rest of the contest. There is a need for some kind of constitutional premise for how competition takes place. Equally, in classical liberalism, Adam Smith or something, the state is not part of the economy. The state and the economy are two separate entities. So that was really, I suppose, what I was trying to say is that, as far as Hayek's concerned, the sort of static knowledge that is generated by experts, which is a type of knowledge that is slow to produce, which claims a level of rationality not available to other people, is criticized in favor of this kind of fluid knowledge, a type of just-in-time, real-time knowledge that the market alone can generate, but which my reference to big data and this sort of thing is that, in a way, the promise of something like big data or smart cities or smart all sorts of things is that type of real-time data can come to supplant the role of traditional forms of expertise in public life. So there is, of course, a type of governing going on, but it's not the governmentality of the tradition that was born in the, roughly around about the 1660s, 70s, 80s, in which society first started being represented according to particular techniques of expert quantification and analysis. And I think that is a key part of what's going on here. Of course, nationalism, of course, there is real pain being experienced by various populations. And I think as much as pain, I think fear is an emotion that is perhaps even more important a lot of the time. Fear that society is moving in the wrong direction, fear that the future will be worse than the past. I think that fear perhaps is, if we're going to deal with emotion, and you're absolutely right to say that we have to start talking about emotions again. In a way, suppose the sort of short version of my talk was, you know, if interest can't do this anymore, we're going to have to start talking about passions again. You know, we can't assume that these things can be reduced into the language of interest. We need to start thinking realistically about what Hirschman called passions, but nowadays we would call emotions, affect. And I think that it is possible and necessary to think about the role of these different emotions in public life, and of course pain is an important part of that, and there's clearly both, you know, all of this quite disturbing evidence about the declining mortality rate in particular areas of the United States and of bits of Europe and so on, which correlate to support for nationalism and autocratic regimes. And so there are sort of an embodied affective dimension, but I think that fear is an emotion that needs to be taken very, very seriously here as well, and which doesn't correlate necessarily to standard expert indicators. I mean, a lot of the studies of attitudinal surveys show levels of fear incredibly high in France, which by many sort of economic indicators is not a society that you know, that has suffered from austerity to the same extent that Southern Europe or Britain, for that matter, has. But anyway, thank you very much for your comments.
So thanks a lot for a very, very rich talk and comments, and I think you all had some time now to digest, and it's blinking green, but you don't hear me. That's competition, you see. There can only be one person speaking. So I somehow learned now that we should not have so much fear of emotion, and that we should discuss that also for governance. And there are some questions already. 1, 2, 3 at the moment. We start here. And could you please briefly say who you are and then ask your question?
Yeah, hello, my name is Luis Aue. I work here at the WZB2. And I wondered, what do you think is populists' notion of the societal whole? Because I understand your talk this way, that they actually defy the concept of society in itself, or that they don't accept that there is something like a societal whole, but at the same time in their self-representations they make this statement a lot and state that they want to re-establish a distinct people, a specific race, a specific nation. And yeah, so I wondered, how does that fit together?
Yeah, let's take some more. I think you will next.
Thank you. Fascinating. Stephen Hill, I'm a guest here at the VZB for a few months. It's always interesting to me to hear this discussion and all the theories being put out about why they voted the way they did and why they are like they are, because you're talking about my family members. And so I can always bounce off the theories to what I know about the people I know and why they voted that way, despite my arguments to the contrary. And none of them ever seem to quite fit. My brothers who voted for Trump and are still supporting Trump, they are well off. One graduated from Harvard, they're highly educated, they're lawyers. One is a business executive. You know, in a sense, you have to think of them as, and I have to think of them as a different tribe. We are tribal creatures, humans. And they are in a certain tribe, and you can easily, we sort of beat around the bush about describing what this tribe looks like. And there's this sense when we describe this tribe that we're trying to figure out how to make them more like us, how to get them to stop believing these things. And it's not going to happen. This is their tribe. This is what they believe. A lot of it is based around race. It's based around immigration. It's based around authenticity. It's not so much why did they vote for Trump, it's why did they not vote for the Democrats, for Hillary. There is a sense that Trump was authentic. He was talking about the real issues. Hillary was inauthentic. She beats around the bush. She's been on the stage for so long. She's part of the problem. She's an insider. So it's us against them. And that's just kind of their tribal mentality. So to me, it's not about how do we change them or make them like us. It's about how do we manage the fact that we're all from these different tribes. And we have to figure out a way that they don't destroy the world that we have built up, because they, in some sense, have been on the outside of what, I mean, we don't think of ourselves as a tribe because we're in the tribe. But from their point of view, we are clearly a tribe. So it's complicated, and there's a lot more I could say, but I'll stop there in the interest of moving on.
My name is Clemens Witte. I'm working at the Dialogue of Civilizations Research Institute in Berlin. And I just had a short comment to the previous speakers. I think it's also a little bit dangerous to start to speak of they and we, because I think we creating two categories, and maybe that's not always helping the cause. But actually I just had a short question, and the question was, why is it that you described it also at the university, that the elites, the so-called elites, are so much out of touch? What is it? What's the reason for that? Is it that they live in different worlds? Is it that they just pursue their narrow personal interests? Is it their values? Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Thanks.
Thank you very much for the questions. I'll take them one by one. I mean, what is the societal whole? I think this is a very interesting question, because I mean, to use my Foucauldian frame, of course, liberalism, this is kind of Foucault's point, liberalism has invents a societal whole in the late 17th century, and it's called population, and then it later becomes called the economy in the sort of 20th century and something. So what is this societal whole? Of course, there's an ethno-nationalist answer to this question, but I think that a racist answer to this question. But I think that to go back to what I was saying earlier, which I think is significant about the idea of sovereignty, is that sovereignty is geographically defined rather than defined in terms of population. So the function of the state, of a kind of Hobbesian state, is to enforce the law without mercy within particular territorial boundaries. So it's possible that you could have a kind of vision of sovereignty that wasn't actually dependent necessarily on the question of I mean, you enforce the border. It can be an anti-immigration logic, but that it becomes a type of politics that is not necessarily. Of course, there's a sort of a biological racist version of this as well. But I think that one of the crucial things is to try and resurrect a vision of a state that is not defined by its management of population processes at all, but which is defined by its core Hobbesian function as having a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence in Weber's terms, and that border becomes the key distinction, not the perimeter of the population. It's the territory, I think, would be my observation anyway. On Trump, I mean, I did actually say that this is, the left behind narrative doesn't actually quite, empirically this has been sort of refuted quite heavily, that this isn't, there aren't enough kind of deindustrialized ex-mining regions in the Midwest or in South Wales or wherever in order to bring about these types of populist upheavals. So I totally acknowledge that. And I acknowledge also, and this was kind of my point at the end of my talk, is that I said slightly ironically, we, the metropolitan elite, we are now, I prefer not to talk about tribes, but I fully appreciate that there is now a politics that the academics and universities cannot kind of ignore altogether, because ultimately they represent a type of power that has become politicized, has been dragged into political arguments, that cannot just be sort of ignored altogether, and that is partly call it a cultural war, whatever you want to call it. I'm not talking specifically about how can we change your family's mind. I'm not trying to sort of, I'm not acting as necessarily the peacemaker here to try and sort of say, can't we all get on? And I appreciate there are complex reasons why people, particularly the animosity towards Hillary Clinton is a sort of complex and very long-standing phenomenon. I didn't mean to kind of, I hope I didn't overly stereotype anything along the way. And I'm fully aware that, lots of very, very rich people and people from all sorts of backgrounds did that. So, but at the same time, I think that we have to try and use our powers of understanding and empathy. This is I mentioned several times the R. Lee Russell Hochschild book, which is an attempt to try and empathize with the other side of the divide. I think that, and that's a controversial project in some ways, and it attracts accusations of being kind of soft on racism and all sorts of things. But I think ultimately there is the production of more and more facts clearly isn't going to get us very far when it comes to a type of developing a politics out of this situation. That is something which I think centrist technocratic parties have discovered is that the hard way is that coming up with more and more facts is not the answer politically. In terms of why are elites so out of touch? I mean, I think this is a good question. I mean, I think so. One thing that I think that clearly happened over the course of the 1990s, which people, I mean, in a way, you've probably heard of Richard Florida, the sort of urban guru who advises urban centres on how to become kind of post-industrial clusters and centres of creativity and wealth creation. But in a way, what I think the vision of the kind of university-led urban cluster full of multicultural values and spin-outs and a knowledge economy and so on and creativity did was to kind of hoard all multiple forms of advantage and capital all in the same places. That in the sense that, I mean, if in the 1960s you might have had high levels of cultural capital but not been a major business player, or you might have been a major business player but not had the same levels of cultural capital. I mean, there was sort of, I think that part of that project of the kind of post-industrial reformation of those areas that generate all of that wealth, which broke very, very heavily for Clinton and for Remain in 2016, is that those are places that I think probably didn't realize how much richer they were a lot of the time than the rest of the country. I mean, I don't think there isn't a sort of, I don't think that the comparative perspective, I think that the bringing together of cultural and economic advantage into a single index of this elite was something that I think people weren't really aware of. It was in some ways a kind of deliberate policy program for the last sort of 25 years or so, which was to try and, which was that cities were going to become the motors of prosperity in a post-industrial age. And I think in some ways that worked, but it also, there was never any question about, well, what does that mean for small towns and rural areas? That somehow seemed to get left out when, as I say, I'm not accusing Saskia Sassen of being complicit in it politically, but that recognition that maybe actually post-industrialization, that maybe downtown Manhattan and central London and Milan, or these were the places that were going to be the centers of the global economy, which was quite surprising for a while, at a time when cities seemed to be being kind of emptied out and suburbanization was still going on. But as that drift away from the cities got reversed, which was really in the United States, it was around about 1990, from cities and rural areas were getting closer in economic fortunes over most of from the post-war period on to about 1990 in the United States, and that went into reverse from 1990 onwards. So I think that was something which a lot of academics and people working in the knowledge economy were kind of oblivious to the fact that had happened to some extent.
Just a quick point about tribes. I think this is absolutely essential to understanding what's going on, but I would say, coming from the same part of the world that you do, and also having relatives who I believe voted for Trump, they won't admit it, they just, when you come from the Midwest, you don't say anything about politics, it's bad form. But a major factor was they hated Hillary Clinton. And if you took Hillary out of that equation, it's not clear at all that we'd be sitting here having this discussion about the United States. And it's a precarious time, and we don't know where it's going, but it's fluid. It's not what that is to say that Trump didn't just win because of populism. Lots of people who aren't populists voted for him because they didn't like her.
Hate, resentment, fear. We had some more questions over here. You and you.
Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Nina Pohle, Humboldt Universität. I have a question about maybe clarifying the relationship between elite status, the common good, expert knowledge, and hypocrisy.
Can you say that more slowly? Sorry.
Did you understand?
It was a bit quick.
Yeah, so it's about the relationship between elite status, expert knowledge, and hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Because the way I understood your argument, it's like we are at this point now where everyone who claims to work for some common good is automatically accused of being hypocritic, especially if they're working for some public institution. So then this hypocrisy has to do with the combination of the common good and being elitist. That's one of the questions, because I think, as I understand it, that the small people are still allowed to have like big hearts and care for something. I'm not sure if you see it that way. And then there's also this other question, if you have then like people like Elon Musk who are not, I mean, they are clearly kind of self-interested, but still people kind of see them as heroes, and that has to do, I think, with some idea of some common good there.
Hello, my name is Anna Schwenk. I'm a sociologist as well at Humboldt University, and I have two questions. Like, my first question regards who are these populists actually? Are we talking about people who have thin commitments, who just voted for Trump because they didn't like Hillary, who just were fed up with the British government? Or are we actually talking about fanatic supporters? I think that makes a huge difference also for the explanation. And my second question is about why I actually came to this lecture, and I was a bit astonished, probably because I didn't really read so carefully the text below the title, but I thought that the lecture would be about the amalgamation of neoliberalism and populism. So less the question of, okay, so we had this kind of neoliberalism and now we have populism, which is juxtaposed to neoliberalism, but more about how populism is actually a type of neoliberalism, and the ways in which populism is neoliberal in form, because it's not anti-capitalist. And so I was wondering what you think about this alternative frame and how it relates to your question.
Can I just clarify? Sorry. Can I just, so your second part of the question was, to what extent is populism an example of neoliberalism? Was that your question partly?
Yeah. And also kind of the neoliberal techniques of governmentality, in which ways are they a feature of the populist moment, and not something which is contradictory to neoliberalism, but which is part of this neoliberal part of our era of capitalism.
Sure, thank you. The elite status, expert knowledge, and hypocrisy. I mean, I think so the way it tends to work is that there is a level of cynicism that forms of knowledge that purport to be objective and from nowhere are actually from somewhere, and that they have an inbuilt perspective and bias. So in a sense, that's a sort of seizing of various types of kind of, I don't know calling it postmodern, but there is a sort of deconstruction of the interests and the political dimensions that that facilitate and accompany forms of expert knowledge, and a kind of an unmasking going on, which of course is done in various interests in its own right. I'm not sure quite. You wanted me to kind of clarify what I thought about that. I mean, I think that the sense, I mean, this is kind of my argument, is that the sense is that those who, either because they work for the public sector or they work for the university, their knowledge claims are not put to the test of competition, and therefore those knowledge claims are the beneficiaries of a type of monopoly that needs to be criticized and challenged. And this is something that and this is what a lot of Phil Murawski's work is about, this neoliberal epistemology that wants to drag all forms of knowledge and knowledge claim into the terrain of the market, because if it's true and if it's valid and strong, then it will withstand competition. But of course, it also that allows a certain level of kind of junk science and that kind of thing to be brought in. But ultimately, there's I think a sense of resentment towards the unfairness of certain people having control of the means of representation, or of measurement and of expert analysis. I think that in terms of the kind of benevolent kind of billionaire, I think that in terms of the part, I suppose my argument was that the kind of benevolent billionaire doesn't depend on being benevolent for their power or for their authority. They're not. It might be a nice add-on, but I don't think that. I think in a way, as I said at the end, there's a kind of they can be driven by their own passions and their own interests without having to claim that they are acting on behalf of everybody, and that this has a kind of defense against the charge of hypocrisy. That's at least my sort of hypothesis, I suppose. In terms of the other two questions, who are the populists? I mean, this is a very important empirical question, obviously, and I think it comes back a bit to what Frank was saying about this is a fluid situation and we can't lump all of these things together. I'm trying to kind of identify some sorts of ideal types or use some concepts to try and understand some of the broader trends. But of course, this is an empirical, sociological, demographic question. I don't have I can't give you a kind of an empirical answer to exactly where the divide between these things lies. But I think clearly there is a distinction between people who are just sort of sick of some form of technocracy, some form of what appears to be unaccountable power, versus people who are actually going to take to the streets and do something more radical. But I think that what both share is a belief that systems of representation no longer function adequately in whatever way, whether that be the representations offered by experts of society in the form of expert knowledge claims or in forms of representative democracy, that in a sense the idea that the elite do not represent anyone other than themselves is the kind of core claim of populism, that the elite are in cahoots with each other, that they are acting in each other's interests but not in wider society's interest, is necessarily a critique of representative democracy, or it's an attack, a cynical attack on representative democracy. Representative democracy is a sham because the representatives and the represented do not kind of have anything to do with each other. They don't know each other. They've got nothing in common, and therefore that this is a totally broken system. And I think that extends both into people who want to take sort of direct action, but also people who might do something like just cast a very maybe one-off vote for something quite rash because they are so sick of something. On your second point, I think I agree with you. I mean, I thought that's sort of what I was arguing in a way, was that we can spot some continuities here because we can see that there is a populist epistemology lurking within neoliberalism, or a neoliberal epistemology lurking within populism. I'm sorry that it obviously didn't come out as clearly as that, but that was really what I was hoping to argue. Against the notion that there was a sort of growth model that was founded in the kind of late 1970s and then went off the rails in 2008, and that now we're seeing some sort of new thing emerge. I was trying to spot some of the continuities through which there had been a gradual, dissolution of certain types of knowledge claim over some time, and some of the continuities there. So all I can say is I think I think I agree with what you're saying, and
just a slight point that I think is missing here is that in the United States, it was Bannon's nationalism, not neoliberalism. That was the rally call. I mean, this is what they all argued for, is boundaries, a national economic policy, not very well specified who would drive this, but it didn't sound like neoliberalism.
No, sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, and this kind of comes back partly to the question of what is what is the societal whole at stake here, and I mean, Bannon's what he called his economic nationalism was clearly a kind of anti-globalization agenda. I mean, we might be sort of talking slightly at odds, because I suppose I'm focusing more on some of the kind of epistemological dimensions of this rather than rather than think about this as a mode of economic regulation. But clearly, yes, protectionism, economic nationalism, you know, a type of populism that says these jobs are going to come back tomorrow, it has a very, very powerful effect, and that was clearly crucial in some of those pivotal areas of the Midwest in particular.
There was also... Yes, please.
Pardon. I was just wondering how you factor in areas like Central and Eastern Europe, where this has actually been going on for far, far longer. We kind of woke up to this rather lately, but it's a huge déjà vu, I think. But there, of course, rather different economic forces have been at play, and yeah, how does it fit into your picture?
Then that's my chance to ask now.
Oh yeah, go on, please.
I think we have...
Oh yeah.
I wanted to come back to your regret for professionals and established elites, that they are somewhat not treated as fairly in a world governed by emotions. At least one could understand the end of your talk like this. And since we are talking so much about fear, resentment, punishing losers and these kind of negative emotions, I was wondering what would be, in your perspective, an emotional governance or a positive emotion toward expertocracy, boring coalition governments, democracy, because there's also emotions involved in that.
I'm afraid I don't have a very adequate answer on the Eastern European point. I mean, I appreciate that there's there is a longer history here that perhaps Western Europe and North America, yes, was perhaps suddenly kind of rather shocked by. I don't think I can really comment very much without knowing. You know, I'd be sort of extrapolating somewhat from my talk, but I am aware that these are forces that have been at large for some time. I mean, clearly the European Union is a condition of this type of politics to some extent because of the distance of centres of perceived elite power, the sense in which the European Union is a tool for the destruction of the border, and that the technocrat and the elite are people who have got it in for borders. I mean, this in a way is what Bannon was attacking in Washington, D.C. as well, is the idea that policymakers kind of just don't like national borders full stop, and we've got to start taking them more seriously again. I appreciate that there's a longer history here which needs to be taken seriously. In terms of positive emotion, I mean, I think I think it's interesting when you look at the studies that are done of trust in elites, and it's not all bad. You know, it's not. I mean, trust in the media is extremely low in most of the surveys that are done of this in most countries around the world. Pew studies show how disastrously low trust in the media is. Trust in representatives is very, very low. There is a general crisis of trust in, as I say, in these kind of forms of representation. But I think that if you look at the areas where trust is still very, very high, it's actually the medical profession is the area where there is still sort of considerable levels of trust. And in terms of this is something which is true around the world. I think that what there is a demand for, to some extent, is a type of professional that is capable of acting and of rescuing rather than just of narrating and of talking, in a sense, which is the sort of critique of the liberal elite. Now, where that leaves the social sciences exactly is not entirely clear. But I think that, I mean, there have been some universities in the UK that have taken some steps to try and start trying to demonstrate the utility of knowledge on a local area, on a local level, rather than just be perceived to be acting in some sort of level of sort of disinterested kind of objectivity the whole time. So I suppose there is in a sense, to take some of the Hayekian critique seriously is to think about, Hayek's paper, the use of knowledge in society, rather than simply to kind of trade in abstract facts. Now, in terms of what is the emotion that is at stake there, well, it's an emotion of empathy, ultimately, of trying to understand forms of suffering, rather than simply to try and kind of objectify them and quantify them. But this places demands on scholars that they don't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily draw people towards that isn't normally seen as part of the vocation of academia.
I feel a bit guilty now for studying the last trusted profession with medicine, but Frank Fischer had also...
I think it is really important to try to break down the walls of the tribes. This is a difficult challenge. It's clear that just getting more votes will not solve this problem. You can win the next election, but this won't go away. And the place to start, which is something that social scientists can do quite well, is just listen to these people and talk to them. They were left out, and they were left out of a system of neoliberalism that was global neoliberalism was supposed to lift all boats, and we came to realize that that didn't happen, and they're the victims. And I think we need to have listen to them and have discussions with them on maybe even on their own terms. And it's not enough for a university to develop some kind of local new knowledge to apply in the area to build better factories or something. The starting point, because it's about passion, is to sit down and recognize that we're all in it together at some level, and that we have to have a new understanding. It might actually require a new political party that could emerge that would recognize the need that we have to speak to each other. There was even an article in the New York Times about this by a Republican consultant who says that there are a lot of people in the Republican Party who want to break from the Republican Party, start again, so that they could actually talk about the problems in the country in an honest way and encourage people out of the Democratic Party to join with them. Who knows? But it's a kind of, we have to break out of those categories somehow.
Last round of questions. There's one. This question is gone. So, okay.
Yeah, is this on? I think the conversation is important. And, some of the things that are going to be said in that conversation are not going to be nice things. Because, as I said earlier, there's no question that part of what that tribe pivots around is race, immigration. These are uncomfortable issues. The National Election Studies at University of Michigan does a survey every year asking Americans, what do you believe on things like gun control, abortion, every issue you can imagine. Americans' attitudes have not changed in decades on very many things, except in two important areas, on the issue of race and on the issue of government spending. And in the certain parts of the public's mind, these two things are lumped together. I don't want my taxes spent on those people. And that's a difficult conversation to have with people, but it has to happen. And I agree with you that the other part of the United States, where you and I are focusing on the United States, but why not, is that the political system is not set up for this conversation. There's two parties, so easily polarizes. And in fact, most parts of the country are not even a two-party system. It's a one-party system. Most parts, I live in San Francisco. Republicans cannot win in San Francisco. There's too many Democrats. Most parts of the country are this way, one side or the other. Even entire states are this way, so they become political monocultures where the debate and discussion doesn't even occur. So in the United States, we don't have, like you have here in Germany, multi-party democracy. We don't have public financing of campaigns. We don't even have universal voter registration. So the political discussion is being thwarted to some degree by the political institutions, which are not set up for this more nuanced, more difficult conversation that needs to happen. And that's where, out of that frustration builds, my brothers, I'll speak for them again, they would like to have had another choice. Some of them voted for Barack Obama in 2008 because they saw John McCain was too old and too whatever, and like they were like, let's try this guy. We'll give him a chance. By 2012, they couldn't stand him. Okay, so there needs to be more choice, and that's where I love coming to Germany, where you have multiple parties. At least the conversation can get more nuanced. Well, I realize it's not perfect, but compared to what happens in the United States around these issues, it gets quite polarized very quickly.
So maybe just perhaps a bit more of a focus on Europe, where conversation seems to be more possible. I would wonder if we can think about what a possible consensus would look like. So is there any way that, let's say, the populists and the others can agree, and how would that look like? What each side would have to yield, basically? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, there are certain areas which have been mentioned which would be very, very difficult for that to happen. I think that, come back slightly to what I was saying about doctors, I think that the interesting issue is that public health is an area which seems to kind of span, I mean, not in the United States, obviously has its own particular kind of ideological issues about socialized medicine and so on, but public health is an area which the evidence suggests is a key dividing factor within a lot of Western societies today, and seems to be playing a key role of some kind in some of the divides that are emerging. And I think that although this is a kind of, ultimately a sort of, one of the sort of fiscal problems of an aging societies and so on, but I think that that's an area where there is, I mean, in the case of Brexit, one of the great tragedies that a lot of people who were critical of it recognized was that their main campaign slogan was to put more money, that after Brexit there'd be more money to go on the National Health Service. So this, which is almost certainly not going to be the case, but this is something which seems to kind of have an ability, the kind of corporeal dimension in a way of politics, seems to have something that spans the different areas of society, and which I suppose, a different populism could foreground. I think that obviously when it comes to one of the areas that immigration is one of these areas that it's very, very difficult to find compromise between the interests of a business elite and liberal policymakers and people who simply don't want any immigrants coming into their country. So this is obviously not going to be one of those things. But it's a very good question, and yeah, we'll see, I suppose.
No, I'm fine.
Then I want to thank both of our speakers and the audience for wonderful questions. Now we have a lot to think about, from how to change the social sciences and how to engage in conversation and take emotions more seriously as well. We can continue this discussion over wine next door, but Just for everybody else, there will be another capitalism lecture series event in May, on 23rd of May, with Michael Goldman from the University of Minnesota. And he will, well, from a kind of Wallraffian ethnography perspective, turn attention to the elites that we don't know if we love or hate them, and how they financialize real estate and drive capitalism. So thanks a lot for this wonderful talk and for the great comments.